It's a great honor and pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion a lot. Do I need to hold this, or can I? Does it work?
It's for the recording that it's microphone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so my topic is social justice movements, objectivity, and new kinds of proper scientific selves. And so I start by noting that in the 1960s and 1970s, social justice movements emerged in the U.S., Europe, and other places around the globe. Poor people's movements. In the U.S., the civil rights movement. There were feminist movements, and shortly thereafter emerged sexuality, sexual freedom movements, lesbian, gay, bi, transsexual movements, more recently disability movements, and even in the last few years we've seen the Arab Spring and the Occupy movements, right? But I want to go back to the 1960s and 70s. Each of these social movements, then, the civil rights, the women's movement, poor people's movements, there were scientific and technological issues that they raised from the very beginning. They understood that sciences and their societies co-produce each other. A sexist society will produce sexist sciences, and those sciences further support a sexist society. And the civil rights movement said the same thing about race, that a white supremacist society will produce racist sciences, and those racist sciences justify and legitimate the racist societies. So the new social justice movements, as I'll call them, already understood something very, very radical. That sciences are never autonomous from their societies. They're never completely free of a culture's social values and interests. In the 1970s emerged the science studies movement. This is an academic movement of historians, sociologists, ethnographers, and so forth, economists, political scientists, who study the production of scientific knowledge. Thomas Kuhn's very famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, was published in 1962. And it was one important beginning for these science studies movements. So my talk today is at the intersection of those new ways of understanding science and how they arrived from the new social justice movements, and the social justice movements in turn created them. Okay, so sciences, including science studies, and their societies co-produce each other. I will talk only about the women's movement, but I'm going to point out that what I say about the women's movement applies to all these other social justice movements too. These movements produced a new logic of scientific research, a new way of understanding how to do good research. Because the problem for these movements was not bad science. There's plenty of bad science around, and it's a problem. But the problem was good science. The very best science was male supremacist, racist, class biased, and we could go on. Had been part of colonialism. And so you can see how radical it was for feminists and thinkers in these other movements to begin to rethink science in these contexts. So what I'm going to do here in the next 45, 50 minutes is first, very briefly, review standpoint theory and what it does. I'm guessing a lot of you are familiar with it, standpoint theory and its strong objectivity. Who has read anything about it before? Good. Good school. But what I want to then go on and talk about is how this kind of research has produced new kinds of proper scientific selves, new right ways to be a scientist. So let me begin with standpoint theory. Feminist standpoint theory began in the 1970s and was produced simultaneously by people who didn't know each other. It's very interesting. We were all socialist feminists, and that's important because standpoint theory borrowed the logic of the Marxian standpoint of the proletariat. Though it changed it radically so that the Marxists hated us, because we weren't doing what we were supposed to be doing, according to them. But theorists, the first one to write, to develop women's standpoint was the Canadian sociologist of knowledge, Dorothy Smith. And she's at Toronto. And her first paper came out in 1970, was presented in 1974. So that makes standpoint theory, 40 years old? Mm-hmm. 4 decades old. Nancy Hartsock at the University of Washington began writing on standpoint theory in the late 1970s. Hilary Rose in England was a sociologist of science. She published a paper in the journal Science in 1983, and I and a number of other people followed along. And standpoint theory has spread all over the social sciences and into those parts of the natural sciences that have effects on people. And every part of the natural sciences has effects on people. Bombs drop on people, right? It's by now a widely used methodology and epistemology. Not method, as in doing survey research or participant observation, but methodology, that is theory of how to do good research, theory of method. And, as you can imagine, it remains highly controversial because it's very radical. It challenges very deep conventional ways of thinking about science. So standpoint theory starts out with the perception that what we do both enables, makes possible, and limits what we can know. And what we can know both makes possible and limits what we can do. That's another way of saying that sciences and their societies co-produce each other. Okay, how we live shapes what we can and can't know about ourselves and the world around us. And the problem that was identified in this early feminist and other social justice research was that research projects tended to originate from elite institutions and their practitioners. And the kinds of issues that women were worried about, that African Americans, that poor people were worried about, never got to the starting point of scientific inquiry. Our questions about our bodies, about violence against women, about how come we had a double day of work, about unequal wages, about exclusion from the law, from medicine, I could go on and on. Those kinds of questions were not important scientific questions until feminism came along. Our life trajectories, we women, was thought of as natural. We were closer to nature. Men make culture, women make babies. I apologize to the men in the room. It's going to be a little now and then. So the early, if you look at the early writings by feminist sociologists, anthropologists, historians, and so forth, particularly the social scientists and the biologists working on areas of women's health, they started off their research not from the important questions to the American Medical Association or the World Bank, but for the questions that arose from women's everyday lives. And I edited an early collection of papers on that included a number of these that is still a bestseller, and it's, 30 years old, Feminism and Methodology. It's a terrific collection of like one each early paper from sociology, political science, and economics, and so forth. So standpoint research starts off from women's daily lives, but it doesn't stop there. It's not an ethnography. Though ethnographies can be extremely valuable places to start, they're not required. It starts off from women's lives in order to study up, to look up at the social institutions that design our lives, and figure out what it is the World Bank does that keeps women around the world in poverty. Right? How come after 50 years or 60 years, whatever it is, of third world development, the poor are poorer and the rich are richer? And the vast majority of the poor are women and their dependents. You don't hear that much mentioned in the development literature, right? Probably 70% are women and their dependents. Okay, so the standpoint theory starts off from women's lives to understand those lives in terms that come from those lives, not terms that the World Bank uses to talk about women. So Dorothy Smith says, take the term housework. Is that a phrase in German? Is that a word in German? In Japanese? Housework? Dorothy Smith says, nobody who does it would call it that. That term comes from people who spend their work lives outside the household, not at home, because taking care of a household and children, there gets no pay, there's no retirement plan, there's no limited hours, you're on 24/7, there's no career path, there's no sick leave, there's no vacation time. This isn't, so on the one hand, it doesn't look anything like men's work in the public sphere. And on the other hand, we value it more, everybody values it more, than most work in the public sphere. We want to take care of our loved ones. We want to make sure that they have enough to eat, that the places that they're not, the children have what they need to grow, that the people we love and care for, the elderly, our partners, other members of the household, live good lives. It's not the kind of work like producing another can of cat food, right? It has deep social meaning, and we want it to happen. But the conditions under which it happens are very, very difficult, as I know you know. So start off research from the daily lives of, in this case, women, and try to understand them in terms that come from those lives. And then look at the issues that are raised in women's lives and try to explain how the dominant institutions organize themselves to ensure that as wealth and leisure accumulate in the lives of the privileged, misery accumulates in the lives of the poor. So that's all I'm going to say right at this moment about standpoint theory. You're all very still, so I know you think it, but we can come back to it. I want to turn now to the fact that this kind of research leads to what I've called strong objectivity. So the standard for good research is that it be fair, to the data and fair to one's severest critics. And conventionally, in traditional ways of thinking about research, it was assumed that maximizing objectivity in research required maximizing value freedom. There should no social values and interests should shape the research project, because then the research that's produced will not be reliable. It'll only be reliable for the group who produced it or likes to think that way. So maximizing objectivity required maximizing value freedom. Well, you can see that the early feminist researchers, as in other social justice movements, were aware that something very strange was happening. Their research was highly directed by social and political values and interests. It was feminist research. They wanted to improve women's lives. They wanted us to have better knowledge of our bodies and our bodies be treated better. They wanted to stop violence against women, and so forth and so on. So it should have produced bad results of research, right? Because it was directed by distinctly local political values and interests. But in fact, it produced empirical data that was more reliable than the supposedly value-free work. And it was more comprehensive. It talked about kinds of issues that had not been talked about in the dominant research. So it was a problem. Obviously, the conventional epistemologies and philosophies of science weren't going to be very happy with this research, right? It's a puzzle to them. It's a mystery to them. How could all this value-directed, politically directed research be producing empirically more reliable and more comprehensive results of research? So people like me and others in philosophy and people who think about the ideals of good research, rationality, good method, objectivity, we couldn't figure out right, how to talk about what was happening. But we did figure it out. So let me just give a little schema that helps think about why it is that this happens. So this is the teacher's rhetorical questions, right? How is objectivity supposed to be maximized in research processes? By testing, repeating observations across individuals, groups of them, laboratories, right? If I get if I make an observation and somebody else repeats it and we come up with different results of research, you can look at that research and say, oh, that happened because Sandra Harding was making racist assumptions and the person who repeated it was not. So when values and interests differ between individuals or groups of them, the old standard was pretty good at identifying them. But what if the whole group shares white supremacist, male supremacist values and interests? There's nothing in that process that will detect values and interests shared across a research community. And in the case of the kinds of issues that those new social justice movements were concerned with, it wasn't just research communities, it was the whole larger society. Maybe for 500 years even, right? So it seems that the conventional standards for good research did not have the resources to identify values and interests that were shared across communities. And that's where standpoint theory's power lies, because it starts off from outside the dominant institutions and the dominant ways of thinking. It starts out in the lives of people excluded from those institutions. Women didn't design the legal systems, the World Bank, the educational systems, they don't manage them and control them today. So their lives are less typical of the way those institutions think about human lives. So that was one problem, that the standard, what I call weak objectivity, which is the objectivity that's linked to value freedom. I think that's weak objectivity. I hope you like the macho language I'm using. We have strong objectivity, they only have weak objectivity. So one problem was that it didn't have the resources to identify shared values and interests. But the second problem was that it thought that once you'd identified a social value or interest, you should get rid of it from research. Think of Lysenkoism, think of Nazi science, they would say. Yet in the case of the feminist research, it was precisely the feminist values and interests that were advancing the growth of knowledge, that were producing empirically more reliable research. So the conventional notion of objectivity and good research had two major problems with it. And standpoint approaches can't completely eliminate those problems, but they go a long way to blocking them. So let me just mention that if you think it's a little scary if you think that research shaped by values and interests must be unreliable, just for a minute think about the fact that nobody thinks that guns shoot crooked because militarists designed them. Nobody thinks aspirin doesn't work because greedy pharmaceutical companies designed it. So how come the militarists and the corporations get away with their values and interests shaping reliable results of research? You may not like the corporations or the militaries, but that's another issue. It's clear that they don't think that values and interests automatically disqualify research from being reliable. And on the bright side, none of us think that just because somebody wants to find a reliable diagnosis and cure for Ebola or AIDS, that research is going to be unreliable. Those are social values and interests shaping that research. We don't have a problem with them. So how come there's a problem with women's interests shaping research? If there's not a problem with corporations, militaries, and medical people. Okay, just a little something to think about as we move along here. I've been talking about this standpoint theory in terms of the women's movement and feminist research, but I want to note here that every time a new group steps on the stage of history, there are a lot of differences between these social justice groups, but they share at least one thing. They all tend to say the same thing. They say, gee whiz, things look different from the perspective of our lives. That's what the disabled say, what lesbian, gay, queer says, what poor people say, what women say. So standpoint methodology appears to be a kind of organic methodology. It emerges every time a new group steps on the stage of history. It's not usually called standpoint theory. That's a particular intellectual legacy I described in terms of Marxism and so forth. But the logic of research, the rationale for organizing research in these ways is shared across previously excluded groups who are trying to have their questions be answered and gain their role in society. So I'm going to stop here with this first part of the lecture. This is the part on standpoint theory. And after a drink of water, turn to the new kinds of proper scientific selves that this kind of research has produced. So I want to shift and begin with a quotation from a wonderful book entitled Objectivity that came out maybe 10 years ago, that's authored by two very distinguished historians of science, Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison. And the book is a study of atlases, like collections of butterflies from all over the world or violets from all over the world. In the U.S., hotel rooms frequently have these beautiful prints of irises or flowers or something against a perfectly plain background. And they came out of these atlas studies from the 17th century, I think, or at least 18th century, through the early 20th century. And Daston and Gallison show how when technologies of representation shifted, so did the standards for objectivity. For instance, when mechanical modes of recording nature, such as cameras, photography, but also other kinds of automatic recording of nature, our standard notion of objectivity as a kind of mechanical process came into existence. And those beautiful paintings, etches I was referring to, were not, their accuracy was not discussed in terms of their being objective. Rather, they were true to nature, right? And these atlases, whatever the form of reproduction, whether it has been through photography or artists, Daston and Gallison point out, functioned like the internet does today. They permitted scientists who were separated from each other in time or space to work on the same project. They could carry their atlas of orchids of the Amazon into the Amazon and see if that little one they're looking at there appeared in this book or not, right? It permitted scientists in different parts of the world and at different moments in history to work together. Okay, so here's Daston and Gallison talking about objectivity. They're very important for having historicized the notion, showing that it changes over time. Maximizing objectivity isn't a standard. It changes as different forms of representation appear. Here's a quote from them. What is the nature of objectivity? First and foremost, objectivity is the suppression of some aspect of the self, the countering of subjectivity. Objectivity and subjectivity define each other, like left and right or up and down. One cannot be understood, even conceived, without the other. If objectivity was summoned into existence to negate subjectivity, then the emergence of objectivity must match with the emergence of a certain kind of willful self, one perceived as endangering scientific knowledge. The history of objectivity, therefore, becomes part of the history of the self, or, more precisely, of the proper scientific self. So that's the quotation from Daston and Gallison. So, as I indicated, their study identifies new forms of, and this is their phrase, right sight, good sight, right sight. But notice that the word right will carry two meanings here. It's scientifically correct, and it's morally right. Okay, it's right sight in both of those senses. And so my argument here is that standpoint methodology is a new technology of right sight in both the moral and the empirical sense. This starting off research from the everyday lives of excluded groups is a way of improving our understanding, our vision, our sight our observations of ourselves and the world around us. And what I want to do here is point to just three kinds of new proper scientific selves we can see coming out of feminist research, but one can also see coming out of the civil rights, lesbian, gay, bi, trans, and so forth research. And let me just name them, and then I'll say a little bit about each. One is the multiple and conflicted self. A self is not, for standpoint theory, a self is not a unified, coherent whole, as Mr. Nowhere was supposed to be, right? The standard, I characterize the standard view of the objective scientist as Mr. Nowhere. Donna Haraway has said about him, this is a fictional creation, I hope you understand, that he's supposed to perform the God trick. He's supposed to see everywhere in the world from no particular location in it. Okay, so that's why I call him Mr. Nowhere, right? He's the good scientist of the past who's eliminated all of the positivist, if I can put it that way, past, who's eliminated all social and political, ethical characteristics that he might be polluting his research with. He's eliminated those, so he's become unidentifiable culturally, right, historically. He's Mr. Nowhere. Okay, so on the other, in contrast, we have very clearly socially and historically located researchers in standpoint theory, and they have multiple identities, and I'll return to that in a minute. A second form we see is the strategically located researcher, that is locating one's research not outside of the social forces, but very distinctly in it in some particular place. And the third kind I want to mention is the knower who is simultaneously an individual and a collective. And I'll use as an example here, you may be familiar with Rigoberto Menchú, the activist, indigenous activist from Peru who won a Nobel Prize maybe 2 decades ago. Okay, let me come back now and just say a few things about each of these selves. And they're not completely separate. Sometimes the same research has several of those characteristics, nor is it a complete list. And there's others, there's one self I've been trying to figure out how to characterize. Well, let me go through and then I'll tell you what it is. Maybe you can characterize it, maybe you can figure out more. Okay, so multiple and conflicted selves. I'm just going to read a page and a half here from a paper. The Latina U.S. literary critic, Lourdes Torres, points out that the influential Latina autobiographies that began to emerge in the 1980s are not much like the familiar great man autobiographies. She looks at 3 such autobiographies by Cherie Moraga, Gloria Anzaldúa, you probably know her, Borderlands, and the daughter-mother team of Aurora Levins Morales and Rosario Morales. The selves in these accounts, each person's self in these accounts is multiple and often conflicted as members of multiple oppressed groups that sometimes compete for their loyalties. They are U.S. citizens, but also Latina from, what Latina means, right? South American and Mexican, Central America. They may be lesbian and yet loving of their homophobic families. They are feminists, and yet they also need to work with their still sexist brothers and fathers in struggles against racism. The unitary, coherent self, so often depicted in autobiographies of scientists, is not the self of these Latinas. These authors stress the importance of acknowledging the contradictions such selves entail. More importantly, they must learn how to transform such contradictory positions into sources of knowledge and power. Taurus identifies linguistic strategies that are used to give voice to multiple cultural legacies in these works. The authors mix linguistic codes in different ways, writing in English, but sometimes in Spanish or Spanglish. You know what Spanglish is? It's a mix of Spanish and English, which you get a lot in the U.S. Sometimes they translate for English-only readers. Sometimes not. You just have to figure out what the Spanish words in the text mean. These works articulate the mestiza, mixed consciousness, that has developed a tolerance for contradictions and ambiguities, a plural positionality, and shifting and multiple identities. Indeed, feminist and anti-racist work more generally has been full of metaphors of a split consciousness. The famous, brilliant African-American theorist from early in the 20th century, W.E.B. Du Bois, talked about the double vision that African Americans had. They had to be able to see the dominant culture all the time or it would kill them. And of course, they saw their own culture. Bell Hooks, famous African American theorist, one of her early books was entitled Feminist Theory, From Margin to Center. Right? It was coming from the margins, but also at the center. Patricia Hill Collins, another African-American feminist theorist, invented the term the outsider within to describe black women academics who were inside academia and the ways that sociology or political science thought about the world, but were also outsiders to that way of thinking and to that world, and how they could see things that people who were only outsiders or only insiders couldn't see. Being in two places at once reveals the contradictions and limitations and the strength of each. As Bell Hooks argues, one must learn to choose the margin as a space of radical openness. I have, in the Los Angeles public schools, there are 72 first languages. Children come into the schools from homes speaking 72 different languages. So every time you hear how bad the education system is in Los Angeles, think about that challenge, right? You get all these little kindergartners in there. I mean, they mostly speak English too, but their home language is something else. My bilingual students in undergraduate and graduate school often report powerful and disturbing senses of divided loyalties to their immigrant families' home cultures and to the cosmopolitan U.S. university culture in which they find themselves and in which we are supposed to train them. We're supposed to train them up into this U.S. professional culture. Learning to see this kind of difference and displacement as a source of creativity and power requires support groups and exposure to social movements and to their thinkers who articulate the positive aspects of such potentially transformative positions, which can be nevertheless very painful to have to live through. Some of you may remember that in the 1970s, there was great discussion among feminists of the hyphenated identity, the liberal hyphen feminist, the social hyphen feminist, the woman scientist, the woman philosopher. It was always this divided identity that we had, and it seemed we characterized it as a problem. And then people started noticing that it was actually a huge resource. It was the hyphen from which feminism arose. It was the hyphen, the in-betweenness, the liminality of women's positions in a world, women's beginnings to enter a world that had excluded them, that was creating the huge fruitfulness of feminist research. So that's all I'll say right here about that particular kind of new proper scientific self. Okay, but notice it has some characteristics that really are controversial for conventional ways of thinking. Not only the divided identity, but the recognition of the importance and value of these contradictions and conflicts. They shouldn't be eliminated. What does it mean to eliminate the conflict, to not think in terms of the conflict between being a woman and a thinker, right? Or a woman and a lawyer or a doctor or a Supreme Court justice or president of Japan, right? You can think about it. Okay, so that's the first one I wanted to draw attention to, the multiple and conflicted self. The second one is the strategically located researcher. And I'm going to use the example, the primary example here, social scientists in the room will be very familiar with, participatory action research, right, which began in the 1960s as an attempt to provide research for poor people. It was inspired by poor people's movements. And I'm sure most of you have heard of it. There are books out there about it. I'm not going to say a lot more about it. It's participatory action research, so you the researcher participates in an actively organized group, right? If it's people protesting that housing is unavailable, the researcher joins that group and organizes her research coming out of the issues that arise for that particular group. Now, participatory action research is a continuum of practices. It's pretty conservative at one end. At the other end, it's extremely radical. And here I refer to the new collaborative research. Collaborative research, if you search it on the internet, will produce something that's not what I mean. The old way, collaborative research used to refer only to when scientists in different disciplines collaborated. A chemist and an engineer were doing collaborative research when they did chemical engineering. But I'm referring to when the researcher and the objects of study, the subjects of study, work together. And I don't know a lot about the history of this, but I know enough to tell you that one important place it emerged was in Native American research, because it was no longer possible for the archaeologists to go dig up somebody's grandmother's bones and cart them off to the Smithsonian. Right? The Native American movement said no more. That's the end of that. And so the archaeologists had to figure out how to do research then, how to do their archaeology. So they had to develop joint projects with Native American groups that answered questions the Native Americans had about their ancestry or something or other that would show up in the study, and that also was a useful project for the archaeologist. But it has spread widely, and if you want, let me just give you. I forget if I cite them. I think I cite them. Well, I forget if I cite them in that paper that some of you have. There's two wonderful collections of papers on it. One is by Louise Portman. It's called Participatory Research in Conservation and Rural Livelihoods, Doing Science Together. She's an anthropologist at Berkeley, and she works in Latin America around agriculture and environmental issues and health issues. And she and others have designed projects where the local people, equally share in designing and carrying out the research project. That's pretty darn hard, right? And it requires something that's extremely difficult for trained social scientists or natural scientists to do, which is to give up control of the research project. I can't decide whether I'm going to go in and dig up somebody's bones and drag them off for chemical analysis. I don't get to decide what's going to improve the soil in some Peruvian agricultural context. I, the researcher, have to work out a project with the locals. And so that collection, and also the one by Caldwell, Chantoff, and Ferguson, Collaboration in Archaeological Practice, are excellent for understanding what I mean when I'm talking about strategically located research. But I'll point out that standpoint theory is strategically located research. It's at a kind of abstract level, but it's directing us to locate our research projects in existing social relations, not outside them. Okay, so I always talk to my graduate students about who's this research for? Who are the stakeholders in it? Whose questions is it answering? Right? And what's your relationship to this, you, the researcher's relationship to the design of this research project? You're going to get benefit a lot. I mean, I don't let them do collaborative research, let me tell you that. We're supposed to train graduate students up to design all by themselves a research project and manage it and carry it out. We want them to do that. But I tell them, after you get your PhD, you're on your own. This is a good model for thinking about how to position research in ways that advance social justice instead of just the careers of the researchers or whoever's funding them. Okay, so another strategy here that is about strategically locating one's research in social relations can be found in intersectionality. Do you know that came out of U.S. Black critical race theory? Kimberly Crenshaw from UCLA and her colleagues developed that 30 years ago, and there was a terrific special issue of the journal Science, S-I-G-N-S, not too long ago on intersectionality today. It was in 2013, volume 38, number 4. And Kim Crenshaw has an article in there too. Intersectionality was initially developed as a legal strategy by critical race legal theory. And the problem was that the law, the Supreme Court, let us say in the U.S., had no way to conceptualize that black women should be able to represent their interests. If it was women that were the object of the case, black women were too special to be representing all women. So white women represented women. If the issue was race, women's interests didn't coincide with men's, and men's were presumed to be the human black issues. So liberal, capital L, political theory had no thought in terms of interest groups and had no way to think of people who had two kinds of interests, right, that were sometimes competing with each other. So black women's interests were never represented to the Supreme Court. They looked back through all the law cases and could not find ones where black women had been permitted to represent their distinctive interests. It was either white women or black men who represented the interests, supposedly the interests of black women. But it expanded from that early use in critical race theory as a warning to all of us to always recognize that let me take myself, exist at the intersection of class, race, gender, sexuality, whatever else are the dominant social structural features in the society. That is, it's not just women who have gender. Right? Men usually think there's no gender in a room until a woman walks in. There's the humans and the gendered, right? And whites don't usually think of themselves, still don't think of themselves as having a race. right? There's no race issues in the room until somebody of a different race walks in, non-white race walks in. So intersectionality has been used as a rule to guide how the researcher should think of both herself, her function in a research project, and the way the people she's studying function in a research project too, in terms of what's shaping their lives. Using only the gender lens as they talk about it. For example, in the United Nations and NGO world, usually ends up being racist and class biased because all women have class and race identities as well as gender identities. And to the extent that those intersectional identities are ignored, they'll be mistreated by the policy that comes out of such studies. So that's a second kind of a way of thinking about the strategically located research. Okay, let me turn finally to the third one, the knower. Simultaneously individual and collective. And as I said, Rigoberta Menchú won a Nobel Prize for her account of what had happened to her and her people, indigenous group. I think it was Peru, but it might have been Salvador. I think it was Peru. In Peru, in the terrible massacres, and the U.S. CIA was funding all kinds of attacks on indigenous people. It's a sad and sorry history. This was a very moving, wonderful story. She gave an interview in Paris to a journalist who published it as a book entitled I, Rigoberta Menchú. And it got a lot of attention. It drew attention to what the CIA was doing, what was happening to these indigenous groups. And an anthropologist criticized her very openly. It got huge press, said she was lying because some of the things that she said happened to her didn't happen to her. It was not she who got shot in the leg. That didn't happen to her. She wasn't beaten by the CIA thugs. And so she'd already gotten the Nobel Prize. There was this huge furor. If you go back and look it up, it's quite something to read through. I'm just going to tell the story very quickly here. So after 10 years of this kind of, was she lying, wasn't she? The original guy who raised the issue withdrew his claim. He said, fundamentally, she was right. It was her brother who got shot in the leg. It was her cousin who was beaten. And meanwhile, her identity was not of an individual. She was a representative of her group. She was speaking as an individual. She was telling a story. And it was she doing the telling, choosing to do the telling, doing it, just using the particular words and language that she used. But she was describing what happened to her people. And feminists, a lot of us understood that immediately. Because we women have also not been recognized as individuals, right? We're always Mrs. somebody, we're somebody's daughter. You can't find our papers, our diaries, because in history, because they're filed in our family, right? We too have identities that are primarily kinship identities. If you're a traditional good woman, I hope there's no traditional good women in the room. I'm not one. We are not allowed individual identities, but only group historic identities, cultural identities. And you can see this kind of identity all the time in the newspaper these days in discussions about the Middle East, about how the local Arabic or whatever groups have tribal loyalties, and you can't get them to give up their tribal loyalty in Afghanistan and have loyalty to the government in Kabul, right? That their family kinship identity is stronger than what for many of us might be a national identity or a class identity or something, right? It's very tight. It's a pre-modern identity is the way the historians and so forth talk about it. This as we look around the world today and see the new kind of research coming out, we see a lot of this odd kind of simultaneously individual and collective identity. There are the grassroots activists who work in the UN, right? They remain grassroots activists deeply tied into their community in the Andes or a Pacific island or wherever, but they're functioning in the UN on committees to gain rights for their people, right? So they're functioning both in one might be tempted to say, in the modern world and the traditional world. They're functioning with identities that are not the standard modern individual identities. Okay, so I'm bringing this to a close here. I've been talking about the kind of research produced by the new social justice movements and its standards for strong objectivity has simultaneously produced new kinds of knowers, new kinds of proper scientific selves. And this shouldn't be a surprise if we recollect the point I first made, that how we live both enables and limits what we can know. So as we've been learning to live in different ways than women or in the US, African Americans or disabled people, as we've been learning to live in new kinds of ways, we've developed new kinds of senses of self that keep something of the old but take something new there to make new kinds of people. And thus, I think the social justice movements are taking the leadership in relinking scientific research to democratic agendas. Thank you.